Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part two as we look at the Gospel of Luke. And we left off with the birth of Jesus and an issue regarding a census. And I mentioned how the census that's described in Luke's Gospel is a major issue for historians. Why is it? Well, let's look at some of the problems regarding it and then some possible solutions. One of the problems is that during the reign of Augustus, there is evidence of small censuses taking place, but nothing like what Luke is proposing. So you do have during the reign of Augustus, and there are the dates for his reign, evidence of small censuses taking place throughout the Roman Empire, but nothing in terms of a massive census of the entire Roman Empire. Another issue is that when Quirinius was the governor of Syria, and he's the governor that's mentioned in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus would have been close to or was already a teenager. So that's another big issue, that when Quirinius was the governor of Syria, and what Luke is describing is supposed to have taken place at Jesus' birth, Jesus was actually, already or was close to a teenager. So here are some solutions to this issue. One is that when Luke first wrote his gospel, he wrote the information correctly, but this information was changed by a copyist to fix what he or she thought was an error in Luke's gospel. So essentially, when Luke first wrote his gospel, he wrote the information right. He mentioned, you could say, like a small census taking place in Bethlehem in Judea. But when somebody was copying Luke, he or she wasn't aware of what Luke was talking about, but was aware of a census that was done by Quirinius. So this copyist thought that Luke made a mistake and that this was something that took place during Quirinius's term as the governor of Syria, and so the information was changed. But by doing so, this put the Gospel of Luke into historical error. The other possibility is that Luke, writing 9 decades later, just simply made a mistake. To emphasize that point, I want to read here from the book of Acts, which is, as I mentioned earlier, at one time, what we call the book of Acts and the Gospel of Luke were one source together. They were one solid work, and then later they were separated. So here's something that Luke writes in chapter 5 of the book of Acts. And to give a little background here, this is when Peter is preaching to the Jewish leaders and basically is, in a sense, condemning them for their role in the execution of Jesus. And a Pharisaic teacher named Gamaliel stood up and addressed the crowd who were wanting to kill Peter. Then he being Gamaliel, said to them, this would be the Jewish leaders, fellow Israelites, consider carefully what you propose to do to these men, the early Christians. For some time ago, Theudas, rose up claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. But he was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and disappeared. After him, Judas the Galilean rose up at the time of the census and got people to follow him. He also perished, and all who followed him were scattered. Well, in terms of chronology, Luke made a mistake. The Judas the Galilean was around at the time of the census that's referenced when Quirinius was the governor of Syria, whereas Theudas was in the fourth decade of the first century. That simply put, Luke, gathering the information that took place around 90 years ago, just made a mistake. It would be the equivalent of me asking someone to write a paper over the New Deal of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and this was the first time the person had ever heard of FDR or the New Deal. Naturally, that person's going to make all kinds of mistakes. To emphasize that point a little bit further, particularly I think of with Theudas and the fact that Luke is writing about, references him, and what happened with him was, 40 years before, the time of his gospel. Something Bart Ehrman writes regarding, the differences in time with, gospel writings when, the person's writing the gospel or a particular work, I should say, but when the incidents described took place. To what extent are these New Testament documents reliable for the historian? And how can they be used to answer historical questions about Jesus? The answers to these questions can be inferred from our earliest analysis of these documents as literary texts. We have seen, for example, that the New Testament Gospels were not written at the time of Jesus' life or immediately thereafter. It appears that Mark, the earliest Gospel, was penned around the year 70 CE or 80 or so, and that John, the latest, was perhaps written around the year 95 CE or 80. These are only approximate dates, of course, but they are accepted by virtually all scholars. Thus, the earliest surviving Gospels were produced 40 to 65 years after the events they narrate. In modern terms, this would be like having written records of Ed Sullivan or Albert Einstein or Harry Truman appear for the first time this year. If you don't know who Ed Sullivan was, well, that's my point. And for those of you that don't know, Ed Sullivan was part of the golden age of television during the 1950s. But essentially, hearing about this information for the first time and writing about this information, you're going to make a number of mistakes. And that's the deal here with Luke. That simply put, Luke, writing about these incidences that took place almost a century before, 90 years before, just made a mistake. So, now going back here to the birth of Jesus, While in Bethlehem for the census, Jesus is born and he's placed in a manger where he is later visited by shepherds. So Mary and Joseph, they arrive in Bethlehem for the census. There's no room for them at the inn. Mary gives birth. She gives birth to Jesus, and she places him in a manger there among the stable animals. And after this happens, these shepherds out in the fields hear the voice of an angel instructing them where to find this king, this Christ, or newborn Savior, you should say, in the Gospel of Luke. And then 8 days later, after the birth of Jesus, he's presented in the temple in Jerusalem for circumcision. And Mary and Joseph, they offer a purification offering as Mary giving birth essentially polluted herself, became out of order. The term that's often used in some of the translations there in Leviticus is the word sin, although sin is misleading here, as this was essentially a purification offering, not anything involving personal moral failing. Um, but while this is taking place, Jesus, the 8 day old Jesus, he is seen by Simeon and Anna. So Jesus is circumcised in accordance with the law of Moses, the Torah, and also within the law of Moses, the Torah, Mary, and be more specifically Mary here, but Joseph, they offer a purification offering due to the fact that Mary, essentially by giving birth, polluted herself. So this is a form of reconciling her, you could say, back to God, or making her pure again. And Jesus, he is visited by Simeon, who is described as a righteous man whom God informed would not see death until he held the Messiah, and he does. And then he informs, God, you can let me go now. I don't mind dying anymore. I don't mind dying. And then Anna, she's described as a prophetess at the temple and also there seeing Jesus. And then after this, Mary and Joseph, they return to Nazareth. And then one other prominent point, with the exceptions of Jesus being born of a virgin, being born in Bethlehem, having a foster father named Joseph, and how this took place when Herod was the client king of Israel, what has just been described in the Gospel of Luke is absent from the Gospel of Matthew. As mentioned, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke describe the birth of Jesus, but they do so in different ways. And what the church has done is essentially has taken these stories and incorporated them into one chronological story. I remember when I took a class, it was during a fall semester, and it was over Jesus. The course was called Jesus of Nazareth. And we discussed the differences in the birth stories. And the professor that I had, asked the class, would you tell the story to the average person in the church as they always heard it? Or would you tell them the differences? Well, we need to stop here.